The process server walked through the pink and white decorations. 40 guests froze mid-conversation. Congratulations on your baby shower, Mrs. Whitmore. You've been served. Caroline stood 8 months pregnant. Her hand trembled on her swollen belly. Her billionaire husband had just filed for divorce, full custody of her unborn daughter, and when she checked her bank account, she found $47. Every attorney in Manhattan refused her case. Conflict of interest, they said. Harrison Whitmore owned them all. So she walked into that courtroom alone. A yellow legal pad from the dollar store. No lawyer, no money, no one. And Harrison laughed. Is there a minimum IQ requirement to contest a divorce? He mocked. Perhaps we should check. But Harrison made one fatal mistake. He underestimated a mother fighting for her child. What happened next shocked everyone in that courtroom. His own attorney stood up, exposed 12 years of lies, forged documents, hidden millions, a pattern of destroying women who trusted him. Then he walked out. Harrison sat alone, and his empire crumbled. This is the story of how one pregnant woman with nothing defeated a billionaire who had everything, how the women he destroyed came back to testify against him, and how sometimes the truth is the most powerful weapon of all. Lesson and value statement. This story carries a powerful message for anyone who has ever felt trapped, silenced, or underestimated. Your worth is not determined by your bank account. Your strength is not measured by the people standing beside you. And your voice matters even when powerful people try to silence it. If you have ever been mocked for fighting back, this story is for you. If you have ever felt alone in a battle that seemed impossible to win, this story is for you. If you have ever wondered whether standing up for yourself is worth the pain, this story will show you that it is. Sometimes the people who laugh the loudest fall the hardest, and sometimes the quiet woman with nothing but courage becomes unstoppable. The crystal champagne flute slipped from Margaret Hollister's fingers and shattered against the marble floor. Congratulations on your baby shower, Mrs. Whitmore. You've been served. Caroline stood frozen near the tower of pastel-wrapped gifts. Her hand rested on her swollen belly. 8 months pregnant. 40 guests surrounded her in the grand living room of the Whitmore estate. Pink and white streamers hung from the ceiling. A 3-tiered cake, shaped like a baby carriage, sat untouched on the dessert table. The process server wore a gray suit. He looked uncomfortable. He should have. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said quietly. I'm just doing my job. Caroline took the envelope. Her fingers trembled. The paper felt heavy, final, like holding her own death certificate. The room had gone silent. 40 women in designer dresses stood motionless. Some held tiny sandwiches. Others clutched gift bags. No one moved. No one breathed. Sloane Whitmore sat in the corner chair. Her posture remained perfect. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her lips curled into the faintest smile. Well, Sloane said, how unfortunate. Caroline tore open the envelope. The words blurred. Petition for divorce. Full custody of unborn child. Emotional instability. Inability to provide adequate care. Her knees buckled. Caroline? Someone grabbed her elbow. Caroline, sit down. She couldn't remember who helped her to the couch. The faces around her swam. Concerned expressions, whispered conversations. Someone was crying. Maybe her. The process server had already left. Caroline read the papers again, and again, and again, each time hoping the words would change. They didn't. Harrison wanted everything. The house, the accounts, the investments, and most importantly, the baby, their daughter. The child she'd carried for 8 months. The child she'd already named in her heart. Eleanor, after her grandmother. Harrison wanted to take Eleanor before she was even born. I need to make a call, Caroline whispered. She pushed herself up from the couch. Her legs felt like water. She walked through the crowd of guests who parted silently. Down the hallway, into the powder room. She locked the door behind her. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold her phone. She dialed Harrison's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. "This is Harrison Whitmore. Leave a message." She hung up without speaking. Dialed again. Voicemail. She checked her phone, unlocked it, locked it, unlocked it, checked for a text, a missed call, anything. Nothing. She dialed again. Voicemail. Caroline stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were red. Her mascara had smeared. The yellow maternity dress that had seemed so cheerful this morning now felt like a costume. A disguise she'd been wearing for years without knowing it. She opened her banking app, bong. The joint account balance glowed on the screen. $47.16. Yesterday, that account had held $200,000. She'd checked it just last week when she paid the caterer for today's party. $200,000. Her safety net, her security, gone. Caroline's legs gave out. She slid down the wall until she sat on the cold tile floor. Her belly pressed against her thighs. The baby kicked, hard. "I know," she whispered to her stomach. "I know." She tried her credit card. The joint Amex they used for everything. Declined. She tried the backup Visa. Declined. She tried the store card she'd gotten for baby supplies. Declined. Every account, every card, every access point to their shared life, frozen. Her phone buzzed. A text message. Her heart leaped. Harrison. She opened it with shaking fingers. "Don't embarrass yourself by fighting this. You don't have the resources or the intelligence. My attorney is Theodore Garrison. Look him up, then sign the papers." Caroline read the message 3 times. The words didn't make sense. This was Harrison, her husband, the man who'd held her hand during the ultrasound, the man who'd cried when they found out they were having a girl. She typed back, "Harrison, please call me. We need to talk about this." 3 dots appeared. He was typing. "There's nothing to talk about. You should have thought about that before you destroyed this marriage." Before she destroyed the marriage, she hadn't done anything. She'd been planning a baby shower, decorating a nursery, choosing names and folding tiny onesies, and dreaming about the future. "I don't understand," she typed. "What did I do?" No response. She waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. Nothing. Caroline pulled up her browser, typed in Theodore Garrison attorney. The results loaded. Her stomach dropped. Theodore Garrison, senior partner at Morrison and Garrison. 40 years of experience, specializing in high net worth divorce proceedings. A perfect record. He had never lost a case. His retainer fee started at $75,000. $75,000. More than she'd made in a year before she quit her job, before Harrison convinced her that his wife didn't need to work, before she gave up everything to support his career, his image, his life. She'd thought she was building a partnership. She'd been building a prison. The baby kicked again. Caroline placed both hands on her belly. "I'm going to figure this out," she said. "I promise." She didn't know how, but she would. She had to. Someone knocked on the bathroom door. "Caroline? Honey, are you okay in there?" She recognized the voice. Patricia something, one of Sloane's friends, not her friend. None of these women were her friends. They were Harrison's connections, his mother's social circle, people she'd been told to impress. "I'm fine," she called back. "Just need a minute." She wasn't fine. She was falling apart. But she couldn't do that here. Not in front of these people, not in front of Sloane. Caroline pulled herself up using the sink. She splashed cold water on her face, fixed her mascara, straightened her dress. She looked at herself in the mirror one more time. The woman staring back looked like a stranger, a scared stranger, a pregnant stranger with no money, no lawyer, and no idea what to do next. But she was still standing. That would have to be enough for now. Caroline returned to the living room to find most of the guests already leaving. They filed past her with awkward condolences. Some patted her shoulder, some avoided her eyes entirely. One woman pressed a business card into her hand. "My divorce lawyer," she whispered. "She's good." Caroline looked at the card, a Manhattan address, a phone number, a lifeline. "Thank you," she said. The woman nodded and hurried away. Her heels clicked against the marble. The sound echoed in the emptying room. Within 30 minutes, everyone was gone. Everyone except Sloane. Her mother-in-law remained in the corner chair. She hadn't moved throughout the entire spectacle. She sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her expression was pleasant, almost serene. "Well," Sloane said, "I suppose the party is over." "Did you know?" Caroline asked. "Did you know he was going to do this?" Sloane's smile widened just a fraction. "My dear, I've known for months. Harrison tells me everything. He always has." Caroline felt the room tilt. "Months. You've known for months. Since you announced the pregnancy, actually. Harrison has had doubts about this marriage for some time. The baby simply accelerated his timeline." "The baby accelerated his timeline," Caroline repeated. The words felt foreign in her mouth, meaningless. "Our daughter accelerated his timeline for divorce." "Harrison's daughter," Sloane corrected. "The Whitmore heir. She belongs with the Whitmores. She's my daughter, too." "Is she?" Sloane stood. She smoothed the front of her cream-colored dress. "You've contributed genetic material, I suppose. But what else? You have no income, no savings, no family to speak of, no skills that would allow you to provide for a child of this caliber." A child of this caliber, like Eleanor, was a product, a luxury item with a quality rating. "I'm her mother," Carolyn said. "Motherhood is more than biology, dear. It's about capability, resources, environment." Sloane walked toward the door. "Harrison will provide all of those things. You cannot." She paused at the threshold. "Sign the papers, Caroline. Make this easy on yourself. Fighting will only prolong the inevitable and drain whatever dignity you have left." "And if I don't sign?" Sloane's eyes went cold. "Then you'll learn exactly how unpleasant the Whitmore family can be when crossed." She left without another word. The door closed behind her. The sound echoed through the empty house. Caroline stood alone in the ruins of her baby shower. Streamers drooped from the ceiling. Uneaten cake melted on the table. Gifts sat unwrapped in their pastel towers. She picked up her phone. Dialed Harrison again. Voicemail. She threw the phone at the wall. It bounced off and clattered to the floor. The screen cracked. A spider web of broken glass spread across Harrison's smiling face in her wallpaper photo. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she walked to the window. The sun was setting over the Manhattan skyline. Orange and pink streaked across the sky. It was beautiful. It had always been beautiful. She'd never noticed before how much the beauty looked like a lie. Caroline took a cab back to the penthouse. She paid with the last of the cash in her wallet, $23. The driver looked at her swollen belly and didn't ask for a tip. The doorman wouldn't meet her eyes. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. His voice was different, stiff, formal. "Evening, Marcus." She'd known Marcus for 3 years. He always asked about her day, helped her with packages, remembered her coffee order from the shop down the street. Tonight he stared at the wall. Caroline's stomach clenched. Something was wrong, more wrong than it already was. She rode the elevator to the 42nd floor. The doors opened onto their private foyer. She stepped out and immediately knew the apartment had been gutted, not empty, just stripped of everything that mattered. Her laptop was gone from the desk. Her jewelry box had vanished from the bedroom. The photo albums she'd spent years curating were missing from the shelves. She walked through the apartment like a ghost through a haunted house. The kitchen still had dishes, the living room still had furniture, but the personal touches were gone. The wedding photos, the vacation snapshots, the framed ultrasound picture that had hung above the fireplace, and the nursery. Caroline stood in the doorway of what should have been her daughter's room. 2 weeks ago, this space had been perfect, a white crib with pink bedding, a changing table stocked with diapers, a rocking chair by the window, hand-painted elephants marching across the walls. Now the room was empty, bare walls, bare floors, nothing but dust motes floating in the fading light. A note sat on the windowsill. She picked it up. The baby will have everything she needs. With me. H. Caroline crumpled the paper in her fist. Then she smoothed it out, read it again, crumpled it again, threw it across the room. The baby will have everything she needs, as if Harrison had the right, as if he could just take their daughter's future and relocate it somewhere else, somewhere without her mother. She sank into the corner where the rocking chair used to be, her back pressed against the wall, her legs stretched out across the bare floor. She pulled her knees up as far as her belly would allow, and finally she cried. Great racking sobs that shook her whole body. Tears that soaked her dress. Sounds that didn't seem human. She cried until her throat was raw, until her eyes burned, until she had nothing left. Then she sat in the silence and tried to understand how she'd gotten here. 3 years ago, Caroline had been a different person. She'd had a career, marketing director for a mid-sized tech company in Boston. Not glamorous, but solid, good benefits, room for growth, a corner office with a view of the harbor. She'd had friends, a group of women she'd known since college. They met for brunch every Sunday, texted constantly, supported each other through promotions and breakups and everything in between. She'd had family. Her mother, Maggie, lived 20 minutes away. They weren't always close, but they were present. Weekly dinners, holiday traditions, the kind of relationship that existed simply because neither of them had left. Then Harrison appeared. He'd walked into her office for a meeting about a potential partnership. Tall, handsome, charming in a way that felt effortless. He'd asked for her number before the meeting ended. She'd given it to him without hesitation. The courtship was a whirlwind. Expensive restaurants, surprise weekend trips, flowers that arrived at her office every Monday. He made her feel special, chosen, like she'd finally been noticed by someone who mattered. When he proposed after 6 months, she said yes without thinking. When he suggested they move to New York, she agreed. A fresh start, he'd said. Just us, building something new. She'd given up her job, her apartment, her corner office with the harbor view. She'd packed her life into boxes and followed him to Manhattan. The first signs came slowly. Her college friends visited once. Harrison was polite but distant. Afterward, he'd made comments. They seemed unsophisticated. Small town. Did she really want to spend time with people who didn't understand her new life? She'd defended them at first. But the visits became phone calls. The phone calls became texts. The texts became nothing. Her mother was next. Maggie had come for Thanksgiving. She'd brought her famous pumpkin pie and opinions about everything. Harrison had smiled through dinner. Later in bed, he'd been brutal. Your mother is embarrassing, he'd said. The way she talks, the way she dresses. I can't have her get around my colleagues. She's my mother, and I'm your husband. You need to decide what matters more. She'd tried to balance both. She really had. But Harrison made it impossible. He scheduled events when Maggie planned to visit. He complained about phone calls that lasted too long. He questioned every holiday spent in Boston instead of New York. Eventually, Caroline stopped trying. She hadn't spoken to her mother in 3 years, hadn't seen her college friends in two. The only people in her life were Harrison's people, his colleagues, his family, his connections. She'd thought she was adapting, maturing, leaving behind a smaller life for a bigger one. Now she understood. He'd been cutting the ropes, isolating her on an island of his own making, ensuring that when this moment came, she'd have nowhere to turn. She'd done it to herself. No, he'd made her do it, and she'd let him. Caroline pulled out her cracked phone. The screen still worked, barely. She scrolled through her contacts. So many names she didn't recognize anymore. Business connections, charity committee members, wives of Harrison's partners. Not a single person she could call for help. She found Danielle's number, her college roommate, her best friend for 10 years. They hadn't spoken since that awkward brunch 3 years ago. The number rang. Once, twice. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. Caroline tried Sarah, her other college friend. Same message. She tried Jennifer, Lauren, Melissa. Disconnected. Changed. Gone. Finally, she tried her mother. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. Hi, you've reached Maggie Brennan. Leave a message, and I'll call you back when I have a minute. The beep sounded. Caroline opened her mouth. Nothing came out. What could she say? Hi, Mom. Sorry I abandoned you, but my husband is taking my baby, and I have $47. She hung up without leaving a message. One more contact. Rebecca, a friend from her old job. They'd lost touch, but Rebecca had always been kind. Maybe she'd still remember. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. Hello? Rebecca, it's Caroline. Caroline Whitmore. Used to be Caroline Brennan. We worked together at... Caroline? Rebecca's voice was confused. Oh my God, I haven't heard from you in years. Harrison told us you didn't want to stay in touch anymore. Caroline's blood ran cold. Harrison told you that? About 2 years ago, he called the office looking for some file or something. Mentioned that you'd moved on from your old life. Said you thought we weren't good enough for your new social circle. The room spun. The floor tilted. Caroline grabbed the wall to steady herself. That's not true, she said. That's not true at all. Oh, Rebecca paused. Well, I mean, we all just assumed. You never called, never wrote. After the wedding, you just disappeared. I didn't disappear. I was... She stopped. What could she say? I was manipulated? I was isolated? I was too blind to see what was happening? I'm sorry, Caroline said. I'm so sorry. I should have called. Are you okay? You sound upset. I'm fine, I'm sorry. I have to go. She hung up before Rebecca could respond. Her hands were shaking again. Her whole body was shaking. 3 years of isolation. 3 years of believing she'd outgrown her old life. 3 years of watching her connections wither while telling herself it was natural. Normal. Part of becoming a Whitmore, but it wasn't natural. Harrison had orchestrated everything. Called her old workplace. Poisoned her friendships. Made her old life impossible to return to. And she'd never questioned it. Not once. Caroline walked through the empty apartment. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Evidence, maybe. Proof that she wasn't losing her mind. She found it in the back of her closet. A shoebox she'd forgotten existed. She'd shoved it there during the move and never thought about it again. Inside were 3 things. Her old passport, the one from before she became Mrs. Whitmore, a photograph of her mother, taken at Caroline's college graduation. Maggie was smiling, proud, hopeful, and a letter, sealed in an envelope addressed to herself. Caroline opened it with trembling fingers. "Dear future Caroline," she read aloud, "I'm writing this on my wedding day. In 2 hours, I'll walk down the aisle and become Mrs. Harrison Whitmore. I've never been so happy." She had to stop. The words blurred. She blinked and kept reading. "Harrison is everything I ever wanted. Kind, successful, devoted. He makes me feel like the luckiest woman in the world. I know some people have doubts. Mom hasn't said anything, but I can see it in her eyes. She thinks he's too good to be true." Caroline laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the empty walls. "But I know better. Harrison loves me. He's going to take care of me. We're going to build a beautiful life together. So this letter is a promise to myself that no matter what happens, I'll remember this feeling, this certainty, this joy." She stopped reading. She couldn't continue. The hope in those words was unbearable. The certainty, the naivety, that Caroline was gone, dead, murdered slowly over 3 years by a man who'd never loved her at all. She looked at the photograph of her mother. Maggie's smile, Maggie's pride, Maggie's warnings that Caroline had ignored. Men like that don't change. They just get better at hiding. Her mother had known. From the very beginning, her mother had known. Caroline picked up her phone, dialed her mother's number again. Voicemail. "Mom," she said after the beep. "It's Caroline. I know it's been a long time. I know I have no right to call, but I need help. Harrison he's divorcing me. I'm 8 months pregnant and I have nothing. No money, no lawyer, no one." She paused, wiped her eyes. "You were right about him. You were right about everything. I should have listened. I'm sorry I didn't. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me." Another pause. The words came harder now. "I understand if you don't want to call back. I wouldn't blame you. But if you get this, I'm at the penthouse. The address is..." The voicemail cut off. Maximum message length reached. Caroline stared at the phone. Then she set it down on the windowsill, picked up her mother's photograph, held it against her chest, and waited for a call that might never come. Caroline didn't sleep that night. She sat on the couch in the darkened living room. The city lights sparkled outside the windows. 42 floors below, people lived their normal lives, going to restaurants, walking dogs, holding hands. She used to be one of them. She couldn't remember what that felt like anymore. At 3 in the morning, she opened her laptop. Not her laptop, Harrison's backup laptop. The one he kept in the guest room. He probably forgot it existed. He certainly forgot she knew his password. She typed it in. Eleanor 2024. The name they'd chosen for their daughter. The year she was supposed to be born. The irony wasn't lost on her. The desktop loaded. Folders appeared. Documents, spreadsheets, business files. She scanned the names. Most meant nothing to her. Then she saw it. A folder labeled Contingency. Caroline's heart pounded. Her finger hovered over the trackpad. Part of her didn't want to know. Part of her already did. She clicked. Inside were dozens of files. Bank statements, legal documents, correspondence with attorneys, and one file that made her blood turn to ice. Prenuptial agreement. Signed. Caroline opened it. The document loaded. Page after page of legal language she barely understood, but she understood enough. This agreement strips the party of the second part of any claim to marital assets, properties, or income accrued during the marriage. The party of the second part waives all rights to spousal support, alimony, or maintenance. In the event of dissolution, the party of the second part agrees to relinquish custody of any children produced during the marriage. And at the bottom of the final page, her signature, Caroline Brennan, dated 3 days before their wedding. But she'd never signed a prenuptial agreement. She was certain of it. Harrison had mentioned one early in their engagement. She'd said she wanted a lawyer to review it first. He'd dropped the subject and never brought it up again. She'd assumed he'd decided they didn't need one, that their love was enough. She was wrong. Caroline zoomed in on the signature. It looked like hers, the same loops in the C, the same flourish at the end. But something was off. The angle, maybe. The pressure of the pen. Then the memory hit her. Their wedding day. She'd been in the bridal suite. Her hair was done. Her makeup was perfect. The dress hung on the door waiting for her. Harrison had knocked. He wasn't supposed to see her before the ceremony, but he'd said it was urgent, important. He needed her to sign something. Just insurance paperwork, darling, he'd said. The company policy requires both our signatures. She'd been distracted, happy, glowing with anticipation. She'd signed without reading, laughed about it afterward. I trust you completely, she'd said. He'd smiled, kissed her forehead, told her he loved her, and walked out with a signed prenuptial agreement. Caroline slammed the laptop shut. Then she opened it again. She needed to know everything, every lie, every deception, every knife he'd planted in her back. She found the bank statements next, not their joint account. Accounts she'd never known existed. Companies in the Cayman Islands, properties in Switzerland, holdings in Singapore. For 2 years, Harrison had been moving money, millions of dollars, funneled through shell companies with names she couldn't pronounce, hidden from their marriage, hidden from their future. The financial disclosure in the divorce papers listed his net worth at $45 million. According to these statements, the real number was closer to $150 million. He'd hidden 2/3 of his wealth, and none of it would be considered marital assets. Caroline felt sick. Physically, violently sick. She ran to the bathroom and emptied her stomach into the toilet. Then she sat on the cold tile floor and cried for the second time that day. She must have fallen to sleep eventually. When she woke, sunlight streamed through the bathroom window. Her back ached from the hard floor. The baby kicked in protest. I know, Caroline said. This isn't exactly a 5-star hotel. She pulled herself up, splashed water on her face, avoided looking in the mirror. She didn't want to see what she'd become. Her cracked phone showed 6 missed calls. Her heart leaped, all from unknown numbers. She checked the voicemails. Telemarketers, spam, nothing from her mother. Nothing from anyone who mattered. Carolyn opened her browser, typed in Divorce Attorneys Manhattan. The results loaded. Hundreds of names, thousands of reviews. She started at the top and worked her way down. Morrison and Garrison. Conflict of interest, Blake and Partners, currently retained by Whitmore Industries. Sullivan Family Law, conflict of interest. Rothman Legal Group. Not taking new clients. Johnson and Associates. Previous business relationship with the Whitmore family. Caroline called 12 firms in the first hour. Every single one turned her down. The excuses varied, but the message was the same. Nobody would touch Harrison Whitmore. Nobody would challenge Ted Garrison. She expanded her search. Brooklyn, Queens, New Jersey, Long Island, same results. At noon, she reached a solo practitioner in Staten Island, a woman named Martha Reyes, who specialized in cases for women in difficult situations. I'd love to help you, Martha said. But I'm looking at the case details, and this is way out of my league. You need someone with resources, staff, experience, and high net worth divorces. Everyone with those qualifications has a conflict of interest. I know. That's not an accident. Men like your husband don't leave anything to chance. So, what am I supposed to do? Martha was quiet for a moment. Have you considered representing yourself? Caroline laughed, not a real laugh. Something broken and hollow. Represent myself against Ted Garrison in a custody battle for my unborn child. I know it sounds crazy, but you might not have another option. Carolyn hung up without saying goodbye. She spent the afternoon researching self-representation in New York divorce proceedings. The internet was full of horror stories. Women who'd lost everything because they didn't know the right motions to file. Men who'd hidden assets while their wives struggled to prove basic facts. And those cases were simple, standard, nothing compared to the web of shell companies and forged documents waiting for her. At 3 in the afternoon, she called the business card the woman had given her at the baby shower. The divorce lawyer, who was supposed to be good, the receptionist answered on the first ring. Henderson Family Law, how may I direct your call? I'd like to speak with someone about a divorce case. Of course. May I ask, who referred you? A woman at a party. I didn't get her name. And the opposing party? Harrison Whitmore. A long pause. Please hold. Caroline waited. The hold music was classical. Beethoven, maybe. It felt like a cruel joke. The receptionist returned. I'm sorry, ma'am. We're unable to take your case at this time. You haven't even heard the details. We've heard enough. I'm very sorry. Good luck. Click. Caroline stared at her phone. The cracked screen. The photo of Harrison still smiling beneath the broken glass. She threw the phone across the room again. This time it didn't survive. The screen went black. The case cracked apart. Fine. She didn't need a phone. She didn't need anyone. She walked to the window. The city spread out below her. $1 million condos, 5-star restaurants, people who had never had to beg for help. She'd been one of them once. Comfortable, secure, oblivious. That woman was gone now. Caroline placed both hands on the glass. The baby kicked. I'm not going to sign those papers, she thought. I'm not going to give up. I don't care if I have to walk into that courtroom alone with nothing but a dollar store legal pad. I'm going to fight. The thought sustained her through the rest of the day. She ordered takeout with the last of her cash, a small pizza from the shop downstairs. She ate standing at the kitchen counter because sitting felt too much like giving up. At 8 o'clock, someone knocked on the door. Caroline froze. Harrison. It had to be Harrison. Coming to gloat, to threaten, to make sure she understood how completely he'd destroyed her. She considered not answering, hiding in the bedroom until he went away. But hiding wasn't fighting, and she'd promised herself she would fight. She walked to the door, took a deep breath, opened it. Her mother stood in the hallway. Maggie Brennan, 58 years old, gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Sensible shoes. A suitcase in one hand and a casserole dish in the other. Before you say anything, Maggie said, I'm not here to say I told you so. I'm here because you're my daughter, and no grandbaby of mine is going to be born with her mama alone. Caroline burst into tears. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning. The location was a mahogany-paneled conference room in the New York Supreme Court building, the kind of room designed to intimidate. Caroline arrived at 8:30. She wore the nicest maternity dress she owned, a navy blue number she'd bought for a charity gala 2 years ago. It still fit, barely. She carried a yellow legal pad from the dollar store. Her notes were handwritten because her laptop had locked her out. Harrison's password had been changed overnight. The room was already occupied when she entered. Harrison sat at the head of the table. His suit probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. His silver cufflinks caught the light. His expression was somewhere between bored and amused. Beside him sat Ted Garrison. White hair, distinguished features, the kind of face that appeared on legal magazine covers. He had 2 junior associates flanking him. All 3 had matching briefcases, matching legal pads, matching pens. Caroline walked to the opposite end of the table, set down her dollar store pad, pulled out the chair and sat. The room went silent. Then Harrison laughed. actually laughed. The sound bounced off the mahogany walls, echoed in the high ceiling. You didn't even bother to get a lawyer? Caroline said nothing. Her hands were folded on the table. Her knuckles were white. Let the record show, Harrison continued, still smiling, that my wife has appeared without legal representation. I assume this is because she understands she has no case. He turned to Ted. His smile widened. Is there a minimum IQ requirement to contest a divorce? Perhaps we should check. The court reporter's fingers paused over her keyboard. Ted Garrison cleared his throat but said nothing. Caroline felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the anger building in her chest. She could fight back. She could scream. She could list every lie he'd told, every account he'd frozen, every friend he'd poisoned against her. But that's what he wanted. A reaction. Proof of her instability. She took a deep breath. Let it out slowly. I couldn't find representation, she said. Her voice was steady, calm. Because every firm in Manhattan has a conflict of interest with your client. I wonder why that is. Harrison's smile faltered. Just for a moment. I also couldn't access my own money to pay a retainer. Because your client froze our joint accounts without my knowledge. And I couldn't prepare properly because your client removed my personal computer from our shared residence. She looked directly at Harrison, along with every photograph of our marriage, every piece of jewelry I owned, and every item from the nursery we decorated together. The court reporter's fingers resumed their work, each word recorded for the official transcript. Ted Garrison leaned forward. Mrs. Whitmore, this hearing is simply to establish timelines and procedures. There's no need for— There's every need, Caroline interrupted. Your client has accused me of emotional instability, of being unfit to raise my own child. I think the court should know exactly how he's been treating the mother of that child. Harrison's jaw tightened. The amusement had drained from his face. You're embarrassing yourself, he said quietly. No, Caroline replied. I'm defending myself. There's a difference. The door opened. Judge Patricia Holloway entered the room. She was in her 60s, silver hair, cropped short, reading glasses perched on her nose. She moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd seen too many cases like this. Good morning, she said, taking her seat at the head of the table. Let's begin. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Harrison's team presented their case with polished precision. Financial documents, psychiatric evaluations from doctors Caroline had never met, testimony from neighbors about her erratic behavior. A complete and total fabrication presented as established fact. Caroline objected when she could, asked questions when she understood what was happening. Mostly she listened, took notes, tried not to let her fear show. When it was her turn to speak, she kept it simple. Your Honor, my husband served me with divorce papers at my own baby shower. He froze our accounts without warning. He removed my belongings from our home, and now he's presenting medical records from doctors I've never consulted. She held up her yellow legal pad. I don't have a lawyer because no one will take my case. I don't have money because my husband controls everything. I don't have evidence because my husband took my computer. All I have is my word and my willingness to fight for my daughter. Judge Holloway studied her for a long moment. Mrs. Whitmore, are you representing yourself? I don't have a choice, Your Honor. The judge's eyes moved to Harrison. Something shifted in her expression, something cold. Then the court will ensure you're given every consideration the law allows. Mr. Garrison, I trust your client can afford to be patient while Mrs. Whitmore prepares her case. Harrison's jaw tightened again. Your Honor, we see no reason to delay these proceedings. My client is eager to resolve this matter and move forward with his life. I'm sure he is. The judge's voice was dry. Nevertheless, this court operates on principles of fairness. Mrs. Whitmore will have adequate time to prepare her response. She set a date 6 weeks away, outlined the documents that would be required, instructed both parties to refrain from contact outside official channels. Then she looked at Harrison one more time. Mr. Whitmore, I've presided over many divorces in this courtroom. I've seen every tactic imaginable. I want to be very clear about something. She removed her reading glasses, set them on the table. This court does not reward cruelty. It does not favor wealth over justice. And it absolutely does not take kindly to husbands who laugh at their pregnant wives in legal proceedings. Harrison opened his mouth to respond. That wasn't a question, the judge said. We're adjourned. Carolyn walked out of the conference room on shaking legs. The hallway stretched before her. Marble floors, high ceilings, the sounds of other cases filtering through closed doors. She found a bench and sat. Her hands were trembling. Her heart was racing. But she'd done it. She'd faced him. She hadn't crumbled. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. A shadow fell across her lap. She looked up. Ted Garrison stood before her. His expression was unreadable. Mrs. Whitmore, a word? I don't think we should be speaking. We shouldn't. He glanced around, lowered his voice. But I've been Harrison's attorney for 12 years, and I've never been able to live with what I know. Carolyn stared at him. What are you saying? I'm saying nothing. Officially. He pressed something into her hand, a business card. But if you were to contact the people on this card, you might find them useful. He walked away before she could respond. His footsteps echoed down the marble hallway. He didn't look back. Caroline looked at the card. 3 names were written in careful handwriting. A forensic accountant, a private investigator, a paralegal. Under each name was a phone number. That night, Caroline sat at the kitchen table with her mother. The casserole dish sat between them, mostly empty. Maggie's specialty, beef stroganoff with egg noodles. Comfort food from a lifetime ago. So what happens now? Maggie asked. I have 6 weeks to prepare a response, evidence, witnesses, a complete case against a billionaire with unlimited resources. And you're going to do it alone? Caroline shook her head. Harrison's own lawyer gave me this. She handed over the business card. Maggie studied the names. Why would he help you? I don't know. Maybe he has a conscience. Maybe he knows something that could bring Harrison down. Or maybe it's a trap. Caroline considered that. It was possible. Everything Harrison did was calculated. Why would his lawyer be any different? But what choice did she have? I have to try, she said. I have to do something. Maggie handed back the card. Her expression was thoughtful. You know, I used to do the books for your father's plumbing business. 20 years of invoices and receipts and tax returns. I remember. I got pretty good at spotting when the numbers didn't add up. Maggie pointed to the financial documents spread across the table. And these numbers don't add up. Caroline leaned forward. What do you mean? Look here. Maggie pulled out a statement. He's showing $45 million in assets, but these transaction records suggest money moving through accounts that aren't listed anywhere. Lots of money. To companies I've never heard of. Shell companies, Caroline said. That's what they call them? Maggie snorted. In my day, we called it cooking the books. Caroline looked at her mother. Really looked at her. The gray hair and the sensible shoes and the no-nonsense attitude she'd inherited. Mom, I need your help. I know, Maggie smiled. Why do you think I brought a suitcase? The forensic accountant's name was William Chen. His office was a cramped space above a laundromat in Queens. The smell of fabric softener drifted through the vents. Ted Garrison sent you? William asked. He gave me your card. Is that the same thing? William laughed. It was a warm sound, genuine. Close enough. What do you need? Caroline handed over the documents she'd found on Harrison's computer. The bank statements, the shell company records, the forged prenuptial agreement. William spent an hour reviewing everything. His eyebrows rose higher with each page. "This is impressive," he said finally. "Impressively criminal, I mean. Your husband has been running a sophisticated money laundering operation for at least 3 years. Can you prove it?" "I can try, but I'll need access to more records, transaction histories, corporate filings, things that aren't sitting in a folder on a laptop." "What about the prenup?" William examined the signature. "This would need a handwriting expert to confirm, but I'd bet my practice this is forged. The pressure points are wrong. The angle is inconsistent with natural writing patterns." Caroline felt a spark of hope, the first real hope in days. "How much will this cost?" William named a figure. It was reasonable, probably too reasonable. "Ted is covering my fee," he explained. "Consider it his contribution to justice." The private investigator's name was Joanne Martinez. She operated out of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn. The walls were covered with photographs and newspaper clippings and maps marked with colored pins. "Harrison Whitmore," she said, studying the file Caroline had brought. "I know the name. Everybody knows the name. You're saying he's been hiding assets and forging documents and making me look crazy so he can take our baby." Joanne nodded slowly. "Men like that usually have a pattern. You're not his first victim. You're just his latest. How do I prove that?" "You find the others, the women who came before you." Joanne pulled out a notebook. "Give me everything you know about his past relationships, ex-girlfriends, former employees, anyone who might have seen his true colors." Caroline thought back. Harrison never talked about his exes. He dismissed the topic whenever it came up. Ancient history, he'd said, not worth discussing. Now she understood why. "I don't know much," she admitted. "He was very private about his past." "That's fine. That's what you hire me for." Joanne smiled. "I have a saying in this business. Every secret eventually finds someone who's willing to tell it." The paralegal's name was Grace. She'd quit Garrison's firm 6 months ago. She agreed to meet Caroline at a diner in Midtown. Grace was younger than Caroline expected, maybe 30. She had dark hair and nervous eyes and hands that wouldn't stop moving. "I shouldn't be here," Grace said. "If anyone finds out I'm talking to you, I could lose my career. Then why are you here?" Grace stirred her coffee. The spoon clinked against the ceramic. "Because I've seen what Harrison does to people. I've typed up the documents, filed the motions, watched him destroy lives and walk away smiling." "You have proof?" Grace reached into her bag, pulled out a thick folder. "I made copies of everything before I left. I know it was illegal. I don't care." She slid the folder across the table. "Your husband has been laundering money through shell companies for years. Everyone at the firm knows. We've all been paid enough to stay quiet." Caroline opened the folder. Bank statements, emails, corporate filings, a paper trail leading directly to Harrison's doorstep. "Why are you talking now?" she asked. Grace's hands stopped moving. Her eyes met Caroline's. "Because last month, Harrison's assistant called me, Nina Castellanos. She wanted to know about his previous divorce cases." "Previous divorces?" "Harrison told me he'd never been married before. He hasn't. But he's had long-term relationships, 3 of them. Each one ended with the woman losing everything. Money, reputation, custody, in one case." Caroline felt cold. "Custody?" "A woman named Pamela, 8 years ago. She had a daughter with Harrison. He wasn't married to her, but he wanted the child. By the time his lawyers were finished, Pamela had been declared mentally unfit. She lost custody completely. Where is she now?" Grace's silence was answer enough. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Nina Castellanos, Harrison's assistant. She's 29 years old. I know who she is. She's also pregnant, 3 months along. Caroline's world tilted. The diner spun around her. She gripped the edge of the table. He's been planning to replace you for over a year, Grace continued. You were never going to keep that baby. He had it all mapped out. The psychiatric evaluations, the financial manipulation, the isolation from Bunkin, everything he did to you, he's done before. Caroline stood up. She didn't remember deciding to stand. Her body just moved. I need air, she said. I need to go. She left the folder on the table, left Grace calling after her, left the diner, and walked into the crowded street and kept walking until her legs gave out. She ended up on a bench in Central Park. The trees were blooming. Children played on the grass. Somewhere nearby, a musician played guitar. And Caroline sat alone and felt the full weight of what she'd learned. She wasn't special. She wasn't even unique. She was just the latest in a series of women Harrison had destroyed. But she could be the last. That night, Caroline called Nina Castellanos. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered. Hello? The voice was young, uncertain. Nina, this is Caroline Whitmore. A long pause. Mrs. Whitmore, How did you get this number? It doesn't matter. I know about the baby. I know about Harrison's plans, and I think we need to talk. Another pause. Caroline could hear Nina breathing, fast, frightened. He told me you were dangerous, Nina said finally. He said you tried to hurt yourself, that you had breakdowns, episodes. Did he show you proof? He showed me medical records, from doctors I've never seen. Caroline kept her voice calm, steady. Nina, everything Harrison has told you about me is a lie. Just like everything he told me about the women who came before. The women who... Nina trailed off. He's done this before, multiple times. I have proof, documents, bank records, a paper trail showing exactly how he operates. Silence stretched across the line. Where do you want to meet? Nina asked. They met at the hospital. Both had prenatal appointments that afternoon. It seemed fitting. Nina was waiting in the lobby when Caroline arrived. She was smaller than Caroline expected. Delicate features, dark hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. The kind of woman Harrison would target. Young, beautiful, alone. Thank you for meeting me, Caroline said. Nina nodded stiffly. I almost didn't come. I spent all night reading those documents you sent. And? And I feel like an idiot, Nina's voice cracked. I believed everything he said. About you, about his past, about our future. Don't blame yourself. He's very convincing. He proposed last week. Nina laughed bitterly. Said he wanted to make things official before the baby came. I said yes. I actually said yes. Caroline sat down beside her. The hospital lobby bustled around them, nurses rushing past, patients in wheelchairs, the constant beeping of medical equipment. He proposed to me at a restaurant in Paris, Caroline said. I was so overwhelmed, I cried in front of the entire dining room. He loved it, loved watching me lose control. Nina wiped her eyes. How did you not see what he was? The same way you didn't see it. The same way none of us see it until it's too late. Caroline took her hand. But it's not too late for you, and maybe not for me either. Nina had copies of everything. Emails where Harrison discussed handling Caroline, text messages, planning the psychiatric evaluations, internal documents showing how the shell companies operated. She'd been collecting evidence for months without knowing what it was. I thought I was learning about the business, she said, being a good assistant. He encouraged me to understand the financial structures. He wanted a witness who could be discredited if necessary, Caroline realized. A pregnant mistress who betrayed the mentally unstable wife, your testimony would have been worthless. Nina looked sick. I was a tool, just like you. just like all of us. They spent the afternoon comparing notes, cross-referencing documents, building a timeline of Harrison's deceptions. By evening, they had something resembling a case. This could work, Nina said, if we present this to the right people. The question is who? Caroline spread the documents across Nina's coffee table. Everyone in the legal system seems to be on Harrison's payroll. Not everyone. Nina pulled out her phone. I have a contact at the DA's office, a woman I went to law school with. She's been investigating financial crimes in the city. Would she listen? She might, especially if we have proof of fraud. Carolyn looked at the mountain of evidence. The bank statements, the emails, the forged prenuptial agreement. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. We need more, she said. We need someone on the inside, someone who knows exactly how Harrison operates. Nina's eyes widened. You're thinking about Ted Garrison. He's already helping. He gave me the leads that got us this far. But asking him to testify? That would end his career. Caroline nodded slowly. I know, but sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to convince its enablers to turn against it. The call came at midnight. Caroline's new phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. Hello? Mrs. Whitmore. Ted Garrison's voice was low, urgent. Are you somewhere secure? I'm at my mother's apartment. She's letting me stay here. Good, listen carefully. Harrison knows about Nina. He knows you've been in contact. Caroline's blood went cold. How? Someone in the office saw the call logs. It doesn't matter how. What matters is that he's accelerating his plans. What does that mean? It means he's going to the judge tomorrow. Emergency hearing. He's claiming you've been harassing his employees and stalking him through third parties. He wants the divorce finalized immediately. Caroline gripped the phone tighter. Can he do that? With the right judge, yes, and Harrison has very deep pockets. So what do I do? Ted was quiet for a moment. The silence stretched. I'm not supposed to tell you this, he said finally. I'm not supposed to be talking to you at all, but there's a reason I've been helping, a reason I gave you those names. What reason? I have 2 daughters. One of them is your age. The other is Nina's age. His voice caught. I've watched Harrison destroy women for 12 years. I've helped him do it. And I can't look my girls in the eye anymore. Caroline felt tears prick at her eyes. What are you going to do? Something I should have done a long time ago. The line went dead. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Carolyn arrived at the courthouse at 1. She wasn't alone this time. Maggie sat on her right. Nina sat on her left. The gallery behind them had begun to fill. Grace, the paralegal, took a seat in the back row. William Chen, the forensic accountant, sat beside her. Joanne Martinez, the investigator, stood near the door, and there were others. Women Caroline had never met. Women Joanne had tracked down over the past weeks. Former employees, former girlfriends, former victims. 7 women in total. All with the same story. All with the same scars. Harrison's face went white when he entered the courtroom. He'd expected to find Caroline alone again, scared, unprepared. Instead, he found an army. Judge Holloway called the hearing to order. Harrison's legal team had shrunk. Only Ted Garrison and 1 junior associate sat at the defendant's table. The matching briefcases were gone. The matching pens were gone. Ted's expression was stone. Mr. Garrison, the judge began, I understand your client has filed an emergency motion. Please proceed. Ted stood. He did not look at Harrison. Your Honor, before we address my client's motion, I need to make a statement. Harrison grabbed Ted's arm. What are you doing? Ted shook him off. I have been Harrison Whitmore's attorney for 12 years. In that time, I have become aware of activities that violate not only legal ethics, but basic human decency. The courtroom went silent, every eye fixed on Ted Garrison. I have been complicit in these activities, Ted continued. I have filed fraudulent documents. I have intimidated witnesses. I have helped destroy the lives of women who had the misfortune of trusting my client. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a thick folder. This is documentation of everything: forged prenuptial agreements, hidden assets, fabricated medical records, a pattern of abuse spanning more than a decade. Harrison was on his feet now. His face had gone from white to red. "You work for me," he shouted. "You can't do this. I worked for you." Ted set the folder on the judge's bench. "As of this moment, I am withdrawing as counsel. I will also be reporting myself to the Bar Association and cooperating fully with any criminal investigation." He turned to face Caroline. "Mrs. Whitmore, I am deeply sorry for my part in this. I should have spoken up years ago. I should have found my conscience before it cost so much." He walked toward the door. "Ted," Harrison screamed, "get back here. I'll destroy you. I'll destroy everyone you've ever known." Ted paused at the threshold. He looked back at Harrison with something like pity. "You've already destroyed everything that matters, Mr. Whitmore. Now it's your turn to face the consequences." The door closed behind him. Harrison stood alone. The hearing continued without his attorney. Judge Holloway reviewed Ted's documents. She called for additional testimony. One by one, the women in the gallery came forward. Pamela, who'd lost her daughter 8 years ago. Now she had evidence that the custody ruling was based on fabricated psychiatric reports. Diana, who'd been fired and blacklisted after ending her relationship with Harrison. Now she had emails proving he'd orchestrated her career destruction. Michelle, who'd signed over her life savings after Harrison's lawyers convinced her she had no case. Now she had proof the documents were altered. And Nina, who was carrying Harrison's child and had nearly become his next victim. She had everything. Caroline testified last. She spoke for 45 minutes about the baby shower, the frozen accounts, the forged prenup, the systematic isolation from everyone she loved. She didn't cry. She didn't waver. She told the truth and let it speak for itself. When she finished, Judge Holloway removed her glasses. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "in my 30 years on the bench, I have never seen a more thorough documentation of marital fraud. The evidence presented today suggests criminal conduct that extends far beyond the scope of this divorce proceeding." Harrison's mouth opened. No words came out. "I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for investigation. In the meantime, your emergency motion is denied. Mrs. Whitmore will retain full custody of the child upon birth. You are ordered to restore all marital assets immediately and to maintain no contact with Mrs. Whitmore or any of the witnesses who testified today." "This is insane," Harrison finally managed. "She's lying. They're all lying. The evidence suggests otherwise." Judge Holloway's voice was ice. "I've seen many men in this courtroom, Mr. Whitmore. I've never seen one so thoroughly convinced of his own superiority. Your arrogance was your undoing." She stood. "This court is adjourned." Caroline walked out of the courthouse into blinding sunlight. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones were thrust toward her face. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth had spoken for itself. Maggie held her hand on one side. Nina stood on the other. Behind them, the other women formed a protective circle. Harrison was led out a side door by security. He was still shouting, still threatening, still promising revenge. But his voice seemed smaller now, weaker, like a storm that had finally blown itself out. That night, Caroline sat in the apartment she'd grown up in, the same apartment her mother had lived in for 30 years. the same kitchen table where she'd done her homework as a child. Maggie made tea. Real tea, not the fancy imported kind Harrison preferred, just Lipton in a ceramic mug. "How do you feel?" Maggie asked. Caroline considered the question. How did she feel? Relieved? Exhausted? Grateful? Terrified? "Like I just survived a hurricane," she said finally. "And now I have to figure out how to rebuild." "You've already started rebuilding." Maggie sat down across from her. "That took more courage than most people have in a lifetime." "I had help. Lots of help." "You asked for help. That's not the same as having it given to you." Maggie reached across the table, took Caroline's hand. "I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you, even when we weren't speaking." Caroline felt tears prick at her eyes, the first tears of release instead of despair. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything, for leaving, for not listening, for letting him come between us." "I know." Maggie squeezed her hand. "I've been sorry too, for not trying harder, for letting my pride get in the way." "Your pride? You think stubbornness is inherited?" Maggie smiled. "Where do you think you got it?" Caroline laughed, a real laugh, the first one in weeks. The contractions started 3 days later. Caroline was in the kitchen making breakfast when the first one hit. A tightening across her abdomen, a pressure that made her gasp. "Mom?" she called. Maggie appeared in the doorway. One look at Caroline's face told her everything. "It's time?" "I think so." The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells, nurses checking her vital signs, doctors monitoring the baby's heartbeat, Maggie holding her hand through every contraction. Nina arrived at some point. She sat in the waiting room with the others, Grace, William, Joanne, the women who'd testified, all of them waiting together. The labor lasted 14 hours. At 11:47 in the evening, Eleanor Margaret Whitmore entered the world. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, 10 fingers and 10 toes, her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubborn chin. Caroline held her daughter for the first time, the tiny body warm against her chest, the little fingers curling around her own. "Hello, Ellie," she whispered. "You're going to be just fine. We both are." The room quieted after midnight. Maggie dozed in the corner chair. The machines beeped softly. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Caroline watched her daughter sleep, the tiny chest rising and falling, the perfect bow of her lips. She'd been so afraid of losing this child, of never meeting her, of watching Harrison raise their daughter to be another victim of his cruelty. None of that had happened. None of that would happen. Eleanor was safe, loved, protected, and Caroline had done that. Not alone, but she'd done it. She'd stood up when standing seemed impossible. She'd fought when fighting seemed pointless. She'd found allies when she thought she had none. Her mother stirred in the corner. "Go back to sleep," Caroline said softly. "I'm just resting my eyes." Maggie's voice was groggy. "Is she still perfect?" "She's still perfect." "Good." Maggie settled back into the chair. "Just checking." Caroline smiled. For the first time in months, the expression felt natural, easy. She was going to be okay. They were going to be okay. 6 months later, the world looked different. Caroline's apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms in a walk-up building in Brooklyn. The floors creaked, the radiator clanked, the neighbors were too loud on weekends. She loved every inch of it. The living room had become her office. Law school applications covered the coffee table. LSAT prep books lined the shelves. She'd decided, somewhere in the chaos of the past year, that she wanted to help other women facing what she'd faced. That meant getting a law degree. That meant starting over. Eleanor played on a blanket nearby. She was sitting up now, grabbing at toys. making sounds that were almost words. "Ma," she said, reaching for Caroline. "Ma, ma, ma." "That's right, baby girl." Caroline scooped her up. "Mama's right here." A knock at the door. Caroline wasn't expecting anyone. She carried Eleanor to the entryway and checked the peephole. Ted Garrison stood in the hallway. She opened the door slowly. "Mr. Garrison." "Mrs. Whitmore." He looked older than she remembered. The past 6 months had not been kind to him. "May I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. Ted sat on the couch. Eleanor studied him from Caroline's lap with the intense scrutiny only babies possess. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Ted said. "I don't deserve it. I helped Harrison hurt people for 12 years. No amount of testimony can undo that. Then why are you here? To tell you what happened. You deserve to know." Caroline waited. "Harrison's been indicted. Federal charges, wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion." Ted clasped his hands together. "The DA is building a case that could put him away for 15 years, maybe more. Good. I'm testifying against him. Full cooperation. My license is already gone, so I have nothing left to lose." He paused. "I thought that would feel worse than it does." "How does it feel?" Ted was quiet for a moment, like waking up from a very long nightmare. Eleanor grabbed for Ted's tie. He let her take it. "Why did you really do it?" Caroline asked. "In the courtroom. Why did you finally tell the truth?" Ted watched Eleanor examine the silk fabric with baby fascination. "I told myself a lot of stories over the years, that I was just doing my job, that Harrison's victims weren't really victims, that money made right and power made truth." He looked up. "Then I watched you sit alone at that table, scared, outmatched, 8 months pregnant with nothing but a yellow legal pad. And you didn't give up. I wanted to give up. But you didn't. That's the difference." So, Ted took a deep breath. "I realized I'd become the villain in someone else's story, and my daughters would read about it someday. They'd know exactly what kind of man their father was." Eleanor released the tie and reached for Caroline instead. Caroline pulled her close. "You could have stayed quiet," she said. "Waited until the investigation caught up on its own." "I could have, but then I'd still be lying, to myself, if no one else." Ted stood. "I should go. I just wanted you to know that justice is coming. Slowly, imperfectly, but it's coming." He paused at the door. "You're going to be a hell of a lawyer someday, Mrs. Whitmore." "Ms. Brennan?" Caroline corrected. "I changed it back." Ted smiled. "Ms. Brennan. Even better." Sloane Whitmore called that evening. Caroline almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Hello, Sloane. You've destroyed this family." Sloane's voice was ice. "I hope you're satisfied. Your son destroyed this family. I just stopped letting him destroy me. He'll appeal. He'll fight. He won't go quietly. I'm sure he won't." Caroline kept her voice calm. "But I'm not afraid of him anymore. I'm not afraid of you either. You'll regret this. Someday, somehow, you'll regret this." Carolyn thought about regret, about all the things she'd regretted over the past years: marrying Harrison, quitting her job, moving to New York, losing touch with her friends, fighting with her mother. She regretted all of those things. They'd cost her years of her life, years of happiness, years she'd never get back. But standing up to Harrison, speaking the truth, fighting for her daughter, "I regretted marrying him," she said. "I regretted every year I spent trying to be who he wanted me to be. I regretted forgetting who I was." She paused. "I don't regret this. Not for a single second." She hung up before Sloane could respond. The next morning, Caroline took Eleanor for a walk. Spring had arrived in Brooklyn. Cherry blossoms lined the sidewalks. Children played in the parks. The city was waking up from winter, stretching toward the sun. They walked to a coffee shop on the corner. Caroline ordered for herself, paid with her own money from her own account. Such a small thing, such an enormous thing. Her phone buzzed, a text from Nina. She kicked today. Want to come feel? Nina was due in 2 months. Caroline had been helping her prepare, assembling a crib, folding tiny clothes, all the things they'd both done before, now done differently. On my way, Caroline typed back. She gathered Eleanor into the stroller, paid for her coffee, stepped out into the sunshine. A year ago, she'd been a prisoner without knowing it. Isolated, controlled, convinced that her gilded cage was actually a palace. Now she was free, not wealthy, not powerful, not living the life she'd imagined when she walked down the aisle in that white dress, but free. 2 years later, Caroline graduated from law school. The ceremony was held in a grand auditorium. Hundreds of graduates in black robes and square caps. Families cheering from the balconies. Professors beaming with pride. Caroline sat in the third row. Her diploma waited on the stage. 3 years of night classes and weekend studying and exhaustion that never quite went away. But she'd done it. She'd actually done it. The dean called her name. She walked across the stage. The applause was polite, generic, the same for every graduate, except from one section of the balcony. Maggie stood there, waving wildly. Eleanor, now 3 years old, sat on her shoulders. Nina was there too, holding her own daughter, a toddler named Hope. Grace, William, Joanne. The women who'd testified, all of them cheering like Caroline had just won the World Series. She accepted her diploma, shook the dean's hand, posed for the photograph, and smiled. After the ceremony, they gathered at Maggie's apartment, the same small space where Caroline had rebuilt her life, the same kitchen table covered in Chinese takeout containers. Eleanor ran circles around the living room, chased by Hope. The two girls had become inseparable over the past year, sisters in every way that mattered. So what's next? Nina asked. Big law firm? Corporate gig? Supreme Court? Caroline laughed. Family law, actually. There's a clinic downtown that helps women in abusive situations navigate the legal system. They've offered me a position. Pays well? Pays terribly. But it matters. Caroline looked around the room, at her mother, her friends, her daughter. That's what I learned through all of this. Money doesn't make you safe. Power doesn't make you happy. What matters is knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone take that away. Maggie raised her glass. To refusing. To refusing, the room echoed. Later that night, after the guests had left and Eleanor was asleep, Caroline stood at the window, the city stretched out below, lights twinkling in apartment windows, cars moving through the streets, a million lives being lived. 3 years ago, she'd stood at a different window, 42 floors up in a penthouse that felt like a prison, wondering how she'd gotten there, wondering how she'd ever escape. She didn't wonder anymore. Harrison was in federal prison now, 15 years for financial crimes. His appeals had failed. His fortune had been seized. The Whitmore empire had crumbled. Sloan had died last year. Heart attack. The obituary called her a pillar of society. Caroline didn't attend the funeral. Ted Garrison had started a nonprofit, pro bono legal services for victims of domestic abuse. Redemption looked different for everyone, and Caroline was here, in a tiny apartment with creaky floors and loud neighbors and a daughter who made every sacrifice worth it. She was here, and she was happy. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. No return address, just her name and the Brooklyn address. Caroline opened it at the kitchen table, while Eleanor colored beside her. Inside was a single photograph, her wedding day. She was signing something, pen in hand, laughing at something Harrison had said. the insurance paperwork that wasn't insurance paperwork. On the back, someone had written, "Never forget where you came from." Caroline studied the image for a long time. The woman in that photograph was a stranger now, young, naive, so desperate to be loved that she'd signed away her future without a second thought. She didn't hate that woman. She pitied her. Caroline took the photograph to the kitchen sink, held a match to the corner, watched it curl and blacken and turn to ash. "What's that, Mama?" Eleanor asked. "Nothing, baby." Carolyn washed the ashes down the drain. "Just something I don't need anymore." The story doesn't end there. Stories never really end. Eleanor started kindergarten, made friends, discovered a love for dinosaurs, and a stubborn streak that came from both sides of her family. Nina remarried, a quiet man who worked in education, someone who loved hope as his own, someone who would never sign away anything. Caroline won her first case, then her second, then her 20th. Each victory was small in the grand scheme of things, one woman at a time, one family at a time, but the small victories added up. On the anniversary of Harrison's conviction, Caroline visited the courthouse where everything had changed. The building looked the same, marble floors, high ceilings, the scales of justice carved above the entrance. She walked inside, past the security checkpoint, through the hallways where she'd once felt so small. She found the conference room where Harrison had laughed at her, where he'd mocked her dollar store legal pad, where he'd assumed she would crumble. The room was empty now, just mahogany walls and leather chairs and the lingering ghosts of 1,000 broken families. Caroline stood in the doorway for a long moment, then she smiled, turned around, and walked away. Some stories are about revenge, the wronged party getting even, the villain receiving their just punishment. This isn't one of those stories. This is a story about something harder than revenge, something more powerful. It's a story about a woman who lost everything and found herself, about a mother who fought for her daughter with nothing but courage and truth, about the moment when someone stops being a victim and starts being a survivor. Caroline Margaret Brennan walked out of the courthouse and into the sunlight. The city spread before her, full of possibilities, full of second chances. She wasn't the woman Harrison had married. That woman believed she needed someone else to be complete. She wasn't the woman who'd sat alone at that table. That woman had been terrified. She wasn't the woman her mother had worried about. That woman was lost. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. The title of Mrs. Whitmore died with the divorce papers. Carolyn Margaret Brennan rose in its place. And her daughter would never, ever doubt her own worth. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. Share your own moment when you refused to give up, even when everyone counted you out. And if you want more stories like this, stories about real strength, real justice, rujabas, and real transformation, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support helps us continue creating content that matters. A simple like or share can help another woman find this story exactly when she needs it most. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are stronger than you know. Closing disclaimer: this content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories and valuable life lessons. Every detail has been crafted with intention to entertain, to inspire, and to remind you that no matter how dark the chapter, your story is not over yet.